The harmattan wind swept through Lagos that morning, carrying with it a dry, dusty scent that clung to the air like a warning. The sun was only just creeping above the rusted rooftops when St. Matthew's Primary School began to fill with children. Laughter and chatter echoed across the cracked concrete courtyard, but hidden among the voices was something off. Her name was Grace, a quiet, small girl of about 10 years, with wide brown eyes that always seemed to be watching too closely. She had joined the school just a month ago, transferred from a village in Delta State where her parents claimed they wanted her to get a better education. The teachers welcomed her warmly, but the other children kept their distance. Grace didn't talk much. She didn't play. She just stared. On her first day, Mrs. Jacobs, the class teacher, noticed Grace had a strange habit. While the other children wrote in their notebooks, Grace would draw odd shapes, crooked circles, lines that spiraled inward like a trap, and figures that looked like twisted shadows. When asked about them, Grace would simply smile and whisper, "They tell me what to draw." At first, Mrs. Jacobs assumed she was just an imaginative child. But then the first accident happened. It was during break time. Shuka, one of the bigger boys, had been teasing Grace, poking at her lunchbox and calling her village girl. Grace didn't shout or cry. She only looked at him, her eyes unblinking, until Chuka suddenly began choking. His friends thought it was a joke, until his face turned deep purple and he collapsed. By the time the school nurse arrived, he was gone. They said he had swallowed something, but no one saw him eat. The school went into mourning, but life continued. Parents whispered about curses, but the principal dismissed it as nonsense. Grace, however, sat quietly at her desk the next morning, her lunch untouched, her little hands drawing another strange spiral. Days passed. Then another child died, this time during morning assembly. Ada, a bright and cheerful girl, simply dropped her tambourine and fell to the ground, her eyes wide open, staring at nothing. Some children swore they had seen Grace standing behind her, smiling faintly. Rumors began to spread like wildfire. Some said Grace was a witch. Others claimed she carried a spirit from her village. A few whispered that she spoke to something invisible during class, her lips moving soundlessly when no one was near. Mrs. Jacobs decided to watch her closely. One afternoon, while the other children were outside for sports, Grace sat alone, her pencil scratching across the page. Mrs. Jacobs crept up behind her and saw the drawing, a perfect sketch of the school building, but with dark figures hanging from the windows, their faces twisted in agony. When Grace noticed her, she turned slowly, her smile too wide. "They're not finished yet," she whispered. That night, Mrs. Jacobs couldn't sleep. She dreamed of the strange spiral Grace always drew, the lines moving like snakes, pulling her deeper and deeper. The killings didn't stop. Sometimes a child would be found in the toilet, their neck bent at an unnatural angle. Other times, a healthy boy or girl would suddenly start screaming in class before going silent forever. The teachers were terrified, but the principal insisted they couldn't accuse a child without proof. Yet, every funeral seemed to leave Grace calmer, stronger. Then came the day of the school's end-of-term party. The courtyard was decorated with balloons, the air filled with the smell of jollof rice and fried chicken. Parents came, dressed in bright ankara, laughing and talking, unaware of the shadow that hung over the place. Grace arrived in a spotless white dress. Her hair was neatly braided, but her eyes seemed darker than usual. She walked slowly, as if every step was part of a plan. During the games, she didn't join in. She just stood in the middle of the courtyard, her lips moving in silent prayer, or perhaps a curse. That was when the birds came. Hundreds of black birds, crows and ravens, swooped down from the sky, circling the school, their cries sharp and metallic. Children screamed, parents tried to cover them, but the birds dived at people's heads, scratching, pecking, tearing. And through it all, Grace stood untouched, smiling as if she had been waiting for this. The chaos was unbearable. Parents dragged their children toward the gates, but the crows seemed to guard every exit, swooping down with furious wings. Feathers and dust filled the air, and the once bright courtyard looked like a scene from a nightmare. Amid the screaming, Mrs. Jacobs spotted Grace standing perfectly still, her eyes rolled upward until only the whites showed. Her small hands were raised slightly, as though she were conducting the madness. Mrs. Jacobs fought her way through the panicked crowd, pushing past parents and ducking the bird's claws. When she reached Grace, she grabbed her shoulders and shook her hard. "Grace, stop this. Whatever you're doing." The girl's head snapped forward, her face so close that Mrs. Jacobs could see the tiny veins in her eyes. "They're here for the feast," Grace said, her voice calm, almost sweet. "We only need a few more." Before Mrs. Jacobs could react, a loud crash echoed from the classrooms. One of the old ceiling fans had fallen, hitting 3 children where they hid under a desk. The scream that followed was blood-curdling. The bird seemed to grow wilder, as if feeding off the fear. Grace tilted her head slightly, and Mrs. Jacobs felt something strange, a heat, not from the sun, but from within her chest, like invisible hands pressing hard against her heart. She staggered back, clutching her chest, gasping for air. Then, as suddenly as it began, the bird scattered, disappearing into the gray sky. The courtyard fell eerily silent, except for the sound of crying children and the moans of the injured. Grace lowered her hands. She looked around, her eyes clearer now, almost innocent again. But there was something new in her expression, satisfaction. That evening, the principal called an emergency meeting with the teachers. Everyone was shaken. Some wanted to call the police, others demanded Grace be expelled immediately. But Mr. Okeke, the oldest teacher, leaned forward and spoke in a low voice. "I know what this is," he said. "I have seen it before in my father's village. A child born as a vessel, a home for something ancient. It kills to grow strong." Mrs. Jacobs swallowed hard. "Then how do we stop it?" Mr. Okeke's eyes darkened. "You don't. Not unless you can sever the bond between the spirit and the child before the next moon. But if you fail, the spirit will keep her and she will keep killing." Outside, rain began to fall, soft at first, then heavier, drumming against the school roof. Grace sat alone in the dark classroom, drawing her spirals again. This time, the spiral wasn't just a shape, it was a doorway, and at the center was a black figure with no face, holding the hands of many small children. She hummed a strange tune as she drew, her voice barely above a whisper. And somewhere in the empty halls of the school, the sound of tiny footsteps echoed, but no one was there to make them. The meeting ended in uneasy silence. The rain outside had turned the school compound into a muddy swamp, and the parents hurried their children home, but a few stayed behind. The ones who had noticed the same thing Mr. Okeke had. The ones who had noticed the same thing Mr. Okeke had. In a dimly lit corner of the staff room, Mrs. Jacobs, Mr. Okeke, the principal, and 3 parents sat in a tight circle. The fluorescent light above flickered as the rain beat harder against the windows. "We can't tell everyone," Mr. Okeke said. "If word spreads, panic will take over, and the spirit will know we are coming for it. Such things can sense fear and intentions." One of the parents, a heavy-set man named Mr. Daniels, leaned forward, his eyes wild. "My daughter is dead. You think I'm afraid of some demon child? Tell me what to do." "We need to find the tether," Mr. Okeke replied. "Whatever it is that binds the spirit to her. It could be an object she owns, something she wears, or it could be deeper, something buried in her bloodline." Mrs. Jacobs thought of the drawings, the spirals Grace made every day, without fail. "Her sketchbook," she whispered. "She never lets it out of her sight." They agreed to act the next morning before classes began, when the school would be mostly empty. But unknown to them, Grace was not asleep at home. She sat cross-legged on her bed in the small apartment her parents rented in Ajagunal. The power was out, but her room was faintly lit by the glow of something in her lap, the sketchbook. Page after page was filled with her spirals, and in the center of each spiral, a tiny black seemed to shimmer, as though it were pulling the light inward. "Are they coming for us?" she asked softly. A voice answered from nowhere, deep and slow, like it was speaking from under the sea. Asterisk, yes, let them come. Asterisk, the next morning, the rain had stopped, but the sky was a dull, heavy gray. The teachers and the parents gathered early. They moved quietly, each heart pounding as they approached the classroom where Grace always arrived before everyone else. Mrs. Jacobs pushed the door open and froze. Grace was already there, sitting at her desk. But she wasn't alone. Standing behind her was something tall and thin, almost human-shaped, but made entirely of darkness, its edges shifting like smoke. It had no face, but it leaned low over Grace's shoulder, its long fingers stroking her hair. "You're too late," Grace said without looking up. "It already knows your names." Before anyone could move, the door slammed shut behind them. The windows darkened, as though the daylight had been sucked away. One of the parents tried to run, but the shadow moved impossibly fast, stretching across the room and wrapping around his neck. With a single jerk, his body went limp. Mrs. Jacobs screamed, grabbing Grace's sketchbook from the desk. As soon as she touched it, a searing pain shot through her hand, like she was holding fire. She forced herself to tear at the pages, but the spirals didn't rip. They writhed, the lines moving as though alive. Grace finally looked up, and her eyes were no longer brown. They were pure black, reflecting nothing. "You shouldn't have touched it," she said. The floor beneath them began to crack, thin black tendrils creeping out, snaking toward the living. The cracks in the floor widened with a sickening groan, and from them seeped a thick, tar-like darkness that spread across the tiles like oil and water. The air turned heavy, suffocating, every breath tasting of rust and rot. Mr. Daniels, fueled by rage, grabbed a chair and charged at Grace. But before he could reach her, the shadow behind her extended one impossibly long arm and swept it through him. He froze mid-step, his mouth opening to scream, but no sound came. His skin turned pale, his eyes glassy, and then, like a sand sculpture in the wind, his body crumbled into black dust that drifted toward Grace, disappearing into her. She sighed contentedly, as though she had just eaten a fine meal. "He was loud," she murmured. Mrs. Jacobs, fighting the burn in her hand from the sketchbook, shouted, "Okeke, do something." The old man stepped forward, pulling from his pocket a small leather pouch. He tore it open and flung the contents, a fine white powder, into the air. As it scattered, the shadow hissed, recoiling slightly, its shape blurring like smoke and wind. "Salt and ash," Okeke said through gritted teeth. "It can't hold its form against purity." But the reprieve was short-lived. The darkness surged again, knocking Okeke against the wall with a bone-cracking thud. The pouch flew from his hand, spilling its contents uselessly on the floor. The black tendrils now wrapped around their ankles, cold and wet, pulling them toward the widening cracks. Beneath the floor, it was no longer solid earth. It was an abyss, endless and moving, as though something enormous was breathing below. Mrs. Jacobs clutched the sketchbook tighter, ignoring the pain, and noticed something. The spirals on the pages were spinning faster, and with every rotation, the darkness in the room thickened. Her instinct screamed at her, "If I can stop the spirals, maybe I can stop this." She grabbed a nearby ruler, snapped it in half, and began stabbing the pages, tearing at the drawings. Grace shrieked, the sound unnaturally deep for a child, and the shadow recoiled violently, its head snapping toward Mrs. Jacobs. "You don't understand," Grace screamed, her voice layered with something older, something cruel. "If you close the door, it will still be here. It will just choose another child." Mrs. Jacobs hesitated for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, the tendrils surged upward, wrapping around her wrists, trying to pull the sketchbook from her hands. Okeke, bleeding from the head, forced himself up. "Don't stop. Finish it," he bellowed. With a roar of desperation, Mrs. Jacobs ripped the final spiral in half. The black, in the center bled like ink, spilling over her fingers. The room filled with an ear-splitting howl, and the shadow convulsed, its form stretching, unraveling into strands of smoke that were sucked back into the cracks in the floor. Grace collapsed limp, her eyes rolling back into brown again. The tendrils released their grip, and the abyss began to close, the tiles sealing as if nothing had ever happened. Silence. Only 3 of them remained standing: Mrs. Jacobs, trembling and burned from the sketchbook; Okeke, barely conscious; and one terrified parent who had hidden under a desk. Grace lay on the floor, breathing shallowly, her small hands twitching. But then, just as Mrs. Jacobs knelt beside her, Grace's lips curved into a slow smile. "They're still hungry," she whispered, "and now they know you." From somewhere far away, faint but growing, came the sound of children laughing. Not the living kind. The following week, St. Matthew's Primary School was shut down until further notice. Officially, the news reports blamed the closure on a structural collapse risk after a minor earthquake had weakened the building. Unofficially, the few who had been in that classroom knew the truth, and none of them spoke it aloud. Mrs. Jacobs couldn't sleep. Every night, she woke up to the sound of faint giggles outside her bedroom door, the same kind of giggles she used to hear in the school playground. Sometimes she thought she saw little black handprints smeared along her walls, though by morning they were gone. Okeke had left Lagos entirely, traveling back to his father's village to seek out the old shrine keepers. He sent Mrs. Jacobs one last voice note before disappearing. "It's not over. The spirit is loose now. It will look for more vessels. Watch the children, especially the quiet ones." Grace had been taken to the Lagos University Teaching Hospital for observation. But within 2 days, the nurses began quitting. One claimed she saw Grace standing at the foot of her bed at night, even though Grace was locked in a ward across the building. Another swore she heard the sound of scratching inside the walls. On the 3rd night, the hospital security guard on duty vanished. His flashlight was found lying in the corridor, still on. The CCTV footage showed him walking toward Grace's ward, then suddenly stopping and turning his head sharply, as if someone had called his name. He dropped the flashlight, walked into the darkness at the end of the hall, and never came back. That same night, all the other children in the pediatric wing started screaming in unison. Nurses ran in, but the children's mouths didn't move. The screams were coming from somewhere else, deep and echoing, like 1,000 voices trapped in a well. By morning, 4 children were dead. The cause? The doctors didn't know. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide open, and their lips twisted into smiles. Grace was gone. The hospital swore she had been moved to another facility, but no one could say which one. Over the next few days, strange deaths began popping up across Lagos. A little boy in Surulere, found in his bed with black stains on his hands. A girl in Ikeja, who walked into the middle of a busy road without blinking, her eyes entirely black. 2 brothers in Yaba, who drowned in their bathtub, though the water was only ankle deep. Mrs. Jacobs watched the news with growing horror. She recognized the pattern. They were all children, and each lived less than 5 miles from where Grace had last been seen. Then came the phone call. It was a number she didn't know, but when she answered, the line was full of faint static. "Mrs. Jacobs?" Her heart skipped. The voice was small, childish, Grace's voice. "They're here now," Grace whispered. "They're sitting in your living room." Mrs. Jacobs turned slowly toward her doorway. The faint sound of giggling came from the darkened sitting room. That night, Lagos changed. Mrs. Jacobs stood frozen in her doorway, staring into the shadowy living room. At first, she could only make out shapes, small, crouched figures, motionless in the dark. Then one of them tilted its head, the movement sharp and unnatural, and she realized it was a child, but its eyes were pure black, reflecting nothing. More heads turned toward her, one by one, until every figure in the room was watching. They didn't speak. They didn't blink. They just breathed, slow, steady, and in perfect unison. Her phone slipped from her hand, hitting the floor with a dull thud. That was when they started giggling. The sound swelled, echoing off the walls, becoming louder and more distorted, until it was no longer the laughter of children but something older, deeper, hungrier. Mrs. Jacobs bolted for the door, but as she turned the lock, a cold hand clamped around her wrist. She screamed and yanked free, throwing the door open. only to find the street outside crawling with children. They were everywhere, standing under streetlights, sitting on car bonnets, lining the sidewalks. Silent now, all watching her. Far down the road, she saw a small figure in a white dress step out from an alleyway. Grace. Her braids swayed as she walked, her bare feet leaving wet black footprints on the pavement. She didn't hurry. She didn't need to. Every child on the street shifted slightly, as if they were breathing in time with her steps. "You tried to close the door," Grace said when she reached Mrs. Jacobs. "But it was already open. Now the city is ours." And she wasn't lying. In Ajagunal, parents woke to find their children standing in the corners of their bedrooms, whispering in languages no one recognized. In Lekki, a school bus full of children drove itself into the lagoon. Not one child inside screamed. In Ikeja, CCTV footage caught a playground at 3 a.m., full of children swinging, running, playing, even though every house nearby swore their kids were asleep in bed. By morning, the hospitals were full of bodies. By the end of the week, people began fleeing Lagos entirely, abandoning homes, businesses, everything. But some never made it out. The roads were blocked, not by soldiers, but by children. Hundreds of them, standing shoulder to shoulder, eyes black, faces expressionless. Cars that tried to push through found their engines dying inexplicably, and drivers who got out never got back in. Some say the darkness was no longer just in the children. It was in the water, the air, the very streets. Black stains began spreading on walls, floors, and even people's skin, marking them as chosen. At night, the city glowed faintly from thousands of small windows, because the children never slept. Grace stood at the heart of it all, always in her white dress, always smiling, always humming that same strange tune. The adults who survived whispered that she wasn't the only vessel now. There were dozens, hundreds, and they were spreading. Soon, Lagos would not be the only city. And somewhere in the chaos, Mrs. Jacobs still ran, still hiding, still hearing that giggle behind her no matter where she went. She knew the truth now. This wasn't about killing. This was about replacing, one by one, until there were no adults left. It began with the highways out of Lagos. Those who tried to escape found the roads blocked in ways that made no sense. In some places, overturned trucks formed barricades. In others, hundreds of children simply stood in the middle of the asphalt, side by side, unmoving, their black eyes reflecting car headlights like pools of oil. People who braved it, who thought they're just kids, we can run past them, didn't come back. Witnesses said the moment anyone got too close, the children opened their mouths and screamed in unison, a sound so sharp and deep it felt like it pierced bone. Within seconds, the adults would collapse, their bodies twisting as if yanked by invisible wires. When they stood up again, they weren't the same. Their eyes were black too.